Okay, this is really fundamental anatomy and physiology stuff. So if you can internalize this and remember it, it's going to help you out quite a bit in future classes. There are 4 main tissue types in terms of broad categories in the body. And one is called epithelial, and that's usually defined as the lining of the inner and outer surfaces of the body and of the organs. Connective tissue, that's a pretty broad category that includes quite a few things. Muscle, that's pretty specific, and you'll spend a lot of time studying how a muscle contracts, the whole function, anatomy and function of a muscle cell. And then nervous tissue, the same thing, very specific kind of cell. Well, there's some variations on those, but nervous tissue, very specific details that you'll study on how neurons fire. But in any case, these are the broad categories. These are not specific to this course. This goes across future courses that you will take. So epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So we're going to go over each one. So epithelial tissue, like I said, the broad definition is tissue that lines organs or covers surfaces of other tissues. And the examples given here, the lung, alveoli, the lining of the capillaries, the outer surface of your body is the skin, the soft tissue inside your mouth that lines the inside of your mouth. In fact, the soft tissue that lines the inside of your nose, inside of all the openings of your body. Any opening that leads to the outside is lined with at least a little bit of epithelial tissue. So all the linings of what we call portals of entry and exit are lined with epithelial tissue typically. And then the digestive tract, the lining of the digestive tract. So epithelial tissue comes in a few different shapes, and we're going to look at those. But you may remember the squamous, the flat cells, the cheek cells that you gathered from the inside of your mouth in Biology 1406 and then stained it with a methylene blue, and it looks something like this. And they look a little bit crumpled, but they're fairly flattened in their shape, and you can see the nucleus pretty distinctly. So that's an example of epithelial cells. So squamous means this flat shape of cells, and in this part A, you're looking from above down at a layer of squamous epithelial cells, and on part B, you're looking from a side view, and you can see at the very top surface these very flattened cells. All right, so you have to orientation in terms of how you are looking at a certain image is something that you have to think about, is what is the orientation here. But on this one, you're looking from the side. So squamous is like flat. Sometimes we say like a floor tile, although they tend to be more round than square. But then you have other shapes of epithelial tissue, cuboidal and columnar. Cuboidal are, just like they sound, kind of cube-shaped. Columnar are more elongated, like a column. In, architecture, a column would be long and, kind of semi-cylindrical, or could be a little more on the square shape, but it's elongated. And then you have this term simple. Simple means one layer. So in this picture on the left, you have, on this part anyway, This is a single layer. You're looking from the side view, but a single layer of columnar cells. And in this picture, it's hard to tell that it's a simple, but you can tell it's cuboidal. And cuboidal is, it's not a perfect cube, but something that has a sort of a squarish or cubish shape. So simple means a single layer. All right. So squamous, columnar, cuboidal. Simple is one layer. Stratified means multiple layers. And pseudostratified is something that is actually a single layer, but it looks, at least initially, as if it might be more than one layer. So pseudostratified in this image here, if you were looking just at this part of it, if in the other one that it was a simple columnar epithelium, you had all the nuclei lined up in one place, so it was visually easy to tell that it was a single layer. But there are some tissues where the nuclei might be positioned slightly differently, and it almost looks like there's a couple layers of cells, but it's just an optical illusion because it really is just one layer. So the arrangement of nuclei makes it appear as if there's more than one layer. So that's called pseudostratified. All right, connective tissue. Connective tissue falls into quite a few categories. The general rule of connective tissue that we're going to go over fits virtually all of these. The definition is that you have fairly few number of cells in a large kind of volume of matrix, and I'll go over the exact definition in a minute, but usually you have kind of sparse cells suspended in some other kind of material, and so by and large all of these fall into that or fit that definition. And even if it doesn't fit the definition, these are the ones that are considered connective, so it's really not up to us to decide. But there is a general definition for connective tissue. Now you probably recognize some of these. Blood, adipose fat, bone, and cartilage you probably recognize. Loose and fibrous, that gets down into some of the detail. So here's the definition, which is kind of complicated, but you're going to memorize the underlying parts, I guess. Connective tissue is made up of a matrix, which is kind of like a mixture of different components, consisting of living cells and a non-living substance called the ground substance. So the living cells and the non-living substance. And usually the ground substance is, like I said, more voluminous than the cells, actually. And the ground substance is usually made up of something that's organic and something that's inorganic. So usually a mixture of proteins and minerals or water. Another rule of connective tissue is that fibroblasts are the principal cell type of connective tissue. Fibroblasts make fibers, which is really part of the ground substance. So the proteins that are in the ground substance are fibers. And fibroblasts are motile, carry out mitosis, and can synthesize any of the connective tissues. So fibroblasts are, in a sense, sort of like the stem cells of the connective tissue. So they are not fully differentiated, but they can become any kind of specific cell depending on what the connective tissue is. All right. So when a connective tissue has a lot of cells and fibers, it has not as dense of a matrix. All right. When a connective tissue has less cells and fibers, it has more dense of a matrix. And the type of fibers really defines what the connective tissue is. So there's certainly a balance of collagen, elastin, other fibers, reticular, but the fiber composition is to a large extent what defines the connective tissue. Now, the only exception to this rule is that blood doesn't have fibers. So, but for the most part, this is your definition. This is a very general definition, but it fits by and large the 6 groups. So we'll go over this. And I have to go over these pictures because they're a little misleading, I guess. In this picture, this is a whole cell. A whole cell. So this is a whole cell. This is a whole cell. And then you can see that the cells themselves are kind of sparse, but then there's all these fibers. Collagen, in this case collagen and elastin. And the fibers are secreted by the fibroblasts. The collagen are these thicker. Collagen is usually really helps to hold things together. Elastin is, as you can imagine, it has stretchiness involved there. But in any case, so loose connective tissue would look like this. Now, fibrous connective tissue, it has a lot more fibers. You can see here's the collagen, and the collagen are like really organized into this parallel structure. And in this case, this is the cell, and this is the nucleus of the cell. So I don't know if you can tell, but that's kind of confusing because on the last picture, on this picture, the purple dot was the whole cell, the whole fibroblast. On this picture, you really have to pay attention. This is the cell, and now they're showing this purple dot is actually just the nucleus of the cell. So in any case, but there's a lot of collagen packed together in this fibrous tissue. An example of fibrous tissue would be tendons. Cartilage. Cartilage has cells called chondrocytes, and the chondrocytes exist in little spaces called lacunae. So this is your cell here, and this is the space. And they secrete the material that we would call cartilage. So you can see how the cells are kind of spread out and sparse. There's different kinds of cartilage. This is hyaline cartilage. There's other types. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail though, because this is introduction to tissue types. Bone. Bone is similar to cartilage. You have the cells, ultimately the osteocytes, are found in lacunae, which are those little spaces, and then they secrete and they're surrounded by the material that we call bone. So let me see in this picture. You don't have to memorize all this for sure. Here's an osteocyte, and they're surrounded by this material that they secrete. And the material is mineralized with phosphorus and with calcium and such. So this is mineralized bone. And one thing, I don't know if people know this, but there's a lot of nerves and blood vessels and lymph vessels that run through the bone, which is why when you break a bone, it's so painful because of the neurons, the nerves. Oh, it's the most painful thing. So it's not just a hard material that is, that has calcium in it. It's got living, it's got neurons, and that's going to create pain when you break a bone, that's for sure. All right, fat, adipose. Adipose has adipocytes, which are just cells, fat cells. And what's kind of funny about them is in this picture, it's actually kind of hard to tell, but the little purple thing is the nucleus. Oops. The little purple thing is the nucleus for one of these cells, but the cell is so full of fat that the nucleus gets pushed all the way to the edge. So it's really hard to tell, but each of these purple dots represents a nucleus that belongs with one of these adjacent cells. So adipose does not have matrix, like it's mostly cells. And blood. Blood is a connective tissue, and it doesn't have fibers. So that's something that's kind of important. But it does have a liquid that is more voluminous than the cellular component. So from that angle, it still fits the general definition. The matrix is plasma. All right. So you have different cell types: white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and then you have some other things that are in the plasma, like antibodies, albumin, protein. There's quite a few proteins that are in the plasma, and so we usually say with blood that you have the formed elements, that's the cells, and then you have the liquid part, the plasma. The plasma is mostly water. It contains things that are being carried through the body on its way out. So wastes are being taken to the kidney. The kidney filters the blood and removes the wastes. Nutrients that are coming in are being carried through the blood. Hormones that have been released by various organs are carried through the blood. So everything is in the same highway system, but they're all going to different destinations. Ultimately, you have a certain amount of ions. You guys remember your trace metals. These are necessary for enzyme function and such. You've got bicarbonate. You've got sodium chloride, of course. Bicarbonate is a buffer, pH buffer. It also is, it's really part of how the carbon dioxide is carried. But in any case, and here's some of your main proteins: albumin, the globulins, fibrinogen. And the globulins, fibrinogen is for blood clotting. Albumin is really for blood pressure. And the globulins, unfortunately, whenever these proteins were named, they named some proteins that are in the blood the globulins, and then there are other proteins in the blood called the globins. These are not the same thing, even though their name is almost the same. The globulins, think of the word immunoglobulin, which is antibody. So the globulins are the antibodies. And those are in the plasma. Sometimes we call it the serum. So if you're doing a serum antibody test, it means you're testing the plasma for certain antibodies. Sometimes we call that serology. So if you're doing a serological test, you're testing the serum, you're testing the liquid part of the blood for certain things. Now the globins are carried inside of cells. They're not in the plasma, they're inside the cell portion, so that's different. Like hemoglobin is inside the red blood cells. And the globins carry oxygen. There's a lot of different globins, but they exist inside of cells. Globulins are proteins that are secreted. They're made inside of a cell, but then secreted out, and they're in the plasma. So that's a really important distinction that I think a lot of students mix those up. They think that maybe there's a typo, but there's not. There's the globulins, which are the antibodies. There are the globins, which carry oxygen. Two different groups of proteins. I wish they hadn't named them that way. Just creates some confusion. Okay, so like I said, the plasma is the liquid part of the blood. The formed elements are the cellular parts. So you have red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes. You have white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, and you have platelets. The red blood cells, as far as the formed elements, they're the most numerous. You have a lot of red blood cells. Less than 1% of the cells in the blood are white blood cells. And so it's a very big difference there. When you look at a drop of blood under the microscope, you're mostly going to see red blood cells. Occasionally you'll see a white blood cell. Platelets are going to be hard to see unless you have a really good microscope because they're much smaller. And platelets aren't entire cells, even though they're included in this group. They're really not whole cells. They are pieces of cells that are intentionally pinched off of cells in the bone marrow and released into the blood to help make clots. Another interesting thing is that red blood cells don't have nuclei. So if you were doing a DNA test on somebody and you took a blood sample, what you're going to actually be getting are nuclei from the white blood cells. But it is the red blood cells that contain the hemoglobin. That's one of the globins that carries the oxygen in the blood. Hemoglobin has a cofactor, which is iron. You have to have that iron in order for the hemoglobin to be able to carry the oxygen. White blood cells move around and they can actually exit the blood, the capillaries, the vessels. So white blood cells don't typically exit the capillaries or exit the vessels unless there's an injury. But white blood cells will squeeze in and out of the capillaries and then creep through all your tissues to monitor and make sure there's no foreign cells, no foreign things in your body.